Hey everybody, welcome to the autopsy video. All right, so that hive back there died at some point, and normally in a long Langstroth up here, what happens is they die over winter because they stop moving between frames. And so you'll have frames full of honey, and then the bees kind of dead, so they don't really run out of food, they just aren't able to move between frames. So these bees made it way into the spring here. We had a very cold spring. It's Mother's Day, the first weekend of May, and this is our first time we've ever had 2 days consecutive in the 50s. We had one other day in the 50s, so it's been a cold, miserable spring here. So they ran out of food, but the real interesting thing will be, did they run out of food with food in the hive, or did they move frame to frame to frame to frame to frame? And we kind of solved that problem that long Langstroths have up here, where they cluster and they climb up to the top, and then they freeze there without any food, and they don't move sideways. So that's a weird thing that happens. I don't know why it happens really, but that's what happens. So we're going to look at it and see what we find here inside the hive. All right, let's tear into it here. And these are loose because I've already taken them off once to check for bees. Hopefully I don't get into any live bees here. I know that sounds weird, but I'm not, dressed for it. And this, by the way, is a banana peel from last fall. And for those of you that are new, there are 2 times of the year when that banana works. And it's when they're really building up brood for the spring and when they're really building up for the fall. So that's what we got. And again, they didn't have a ton to make it through winter. So this is basically like a single deep, which is not a cool idea here in Wisconsin. So I was kind of thinking they were going to run out of food, and that's hopefully what happened. So what I'm going to do is tear these apart. I can't do this with one hand. I'm going to tear these apart a little bit, and then we'll go through it frame by frame and see what happened. All right, this is truly one of the coolest autopsy videos I've ever done. And well, I don't know if I've done many autopsy videos, but this is one of the coolest autopsies I've ever done. There's a couple really neat things. First off, look at my staples. See how they rusted? There was a lot of moisture going out of here. Out of this one in particular. My hinge is rusted too, so there's moisture coming out of there. But here's the thing that's really interesting. I'm going to pull out this frame. The bees during the winter start at the bottom and work their way up. You can see they uncapped and started using that honey there. You can see that frame behind them is used as well. But the interesting thing is that these bees made it all the way to spring, all the way till when they start laying brood. There's a little patch there and a little patch on the other side here as well. So the queen started laying brood, but then something happened late in the spring, and I think the cluster just got too small. And we had some horrible weather in the late spring. But the interesting thing, one of the things we learned here, is that look at all these frames. I'll take them all out. They all have the same thing, where they started uncapping in the bottom corner and worked their way up and started eating on that, using that honey. And they moved between this frame, this frame, this frame, this frame, this frame, and this frame. All of those they moved between without any trouble. And then these frames are untouched honey. All of these over here. So they were able to move back and forth and get through the coldest part of the winter. But then, as the winter went on, bees were dying and the cluster just got too small. That's what I think happened. Feel free to comment and let me know below your thoughts, but I think that's what happened. And so what that means is that the hive itself, especially up here in northern Wisconsin, where you get, these really horrific springs. This is the first 2 days of 50-degree weather we've had. I think I said that already. Consecutive anyway. So I think the trick here is just a little bit of wrapping or insulation around the hive to keep them a little bit warmer from the breezes and stuff like that during the spring when that cluster is small and susceptible. And I think that would have done it. And also it would have helped keep the cluster bigger longer. But yeah, with the brood in there, they clearly made it through the depth of winter and got into the spring and the queen started laying. So awesome that way. This is cool. I love the pattern. I love that shows, you know, that they were doing what they were supposed to. You know, they build from the top down, and I know every time I say that, people are like, they don't build from the top down. They build from the top down, fill this with honey, and then they consume in the winter from the bottom up. And so they got this far. But the really interesting thing is they don't go from the bottom all the way up. They go from the bottom up, and then they go over. And so they're going back and forth and up, which is really interesting. So I'm really pleased that they're going back and forth, because in traditional long Langstroths, what happens is they die. This frame is completely empty. They've starved to death, and you know, one frame over, they've got plenty of honey. So that didn't happen at all. I'm really happy about that. So that seems to work really well, and those are the positives. So I'll have a think about it, as they say in Australia, and see if I think of anything else. Put stuff in the comments if you think of anything else. But it looks like that's what happened. They made it through the winter. They started laying brood, and then those last cold snaps got them because the cluster was just too small. And a little bit of insulation would have probably saved them. So that's where we're at. I'm really excited, really pleased with it. I am going to change this door. I'm going to change it. Somebody had a really good suggestion so that it hinges down instead of up, and there'll be a little shelf here. So I'm thinking of making it so it hinges down, there's a little shelf, and then it lays down there, and that'll make it easier, especially if you're coming up here and like you're in a wheelchair or something like that. I think that little shelf down there will really be helpful. You can pull the frames out, set them on there. They'll help you work. So I'm excited about that change, and I'm glad that I don't have bees in there so I can make that change. But yeah, I'm pretty pleased with the results. And there's your autopsy video. Sorry, no aliens. But like I said, let me know if you have any comments, and we'll see how it goes. All right, I've had a day, and I thought I'd share some thoughts on and wrap up this autopsy video. First of all, I got a camera stand now, so now you'll be able to watch me work with both hands, and it won't be me holding the phone in one hand and bees in the other, or trying to hammer or something like that. So, you know, after 6 years, I spent $19.99. Even has a little remote here to turn it on. Anyway, I had some time to think about that autopsy video, and some of the things I said in there, I'm not sure actually the assumptions are valid. I assume that the bees move back and forth. That assumption is really based on the cluster being a certain size, like bowling ball size. And that's based on the last time I inspected it, there were 7.5-ish frames of bees, and you know, if they compress down, it's something less than 7.5 frames, so like 5, right? My assumption is that they did that and that they moved. Now, it could be that they expanded the number of bees and that it was, you know, like a basketball sized cluster, and then they just died off on the edges, and you know, gradually we ended up with nothing. So it could be. But a couple things that we can say for sure. The first thing is that there were no bees with their little heads stuck in the cells. So if you ever have a colony die of hunger, you'll see bees with their heads stuck in the cells and their butts pointing straight up at you, because that's a sure sign they were looking for food and there was just nothing to find. There was plenty of food, so that wasn't the issue. The other thing is there were no white bees covered with mold or anything like that. If you've ever had a hive die with a lot of moisture in it, you'll get moldy bees, and maybe there's one moldy bee or two or something like that, but it's not like a moldy hive where you open it up and there's just a whole bunch of bees covered in white. So that wasn't the case. And another observation, that that group of brood was about that big around on you know, a couple frames. And so that meant that when they started laying the brood, the cluster was, you know, at least that big. So the cluster was, I don't know, pineapple size or something like that. I don't know. I don't know my fruit. Bigger than an apple, around a pineapple. And that would have been at the beginning of March. So the end of February, beginning of March. They were still alive and doing okay then. And I think I posted that video. If I didn't, there were. And then at the end of March is when I checked them, and there weren't really signs of life. And so either they were dead or they were down into just, that bare minimal cluster just trying to hang on. And then eventually they got to the point where they couldn't heat themselves. And that's one of the key takeaways here. There's a study out there that shows that bees, when they're in the cluster, they don't heat the hive, they heat the cluster. And the thing that kills the cluster are external forces on it. So moisture dripping down through it, which is why you want to make sure you control where moisture is dripping. You want moisture in your hive, you just don't want it dripping down through the bees. And then the other thing is drafts, right? And so if you have a cluster and there's a draft blowing across the side or the bottom or the top or whatever, those bees are going to die off really quick because the cluster won't be able to heat it, and it takes away the excess waste heat, I should say, that's useful for them as well, because the waste heat goes up and it keeps the wax cappings somewhat pliable, so it's easier for them to get at. They have less energy to expend to kind of pry that cap off and get at the honey underneath. So there's value to having that waste heat go up, which is why, having them start at the bottom and work their way up and having that waste heat go up those, tall Langstroth frames is a good thing. So I think that we had some external forces attacking the cluster. I'm pretty sure it wasn't moisture because there wasn't any evidence of that. And so I think that it was drafts, and that's from the lid probably. And remember those 90-degree PVC pipes on the top? I didn't plug any of those, and I think that was probably a big mistake. I should have plugged all of them except one, so that there's still some airflow or some movement in there, but it's not like a flow. It's just a place for air to move. So I think that's probably the takeaway. In a perfect world, I have 10 sensors in there and things like that, but I just bought a $20 camera stand. I'm not, if Bill Gates or Donald Trump or somebody wants to write me a check, I'll be happy to put sensors in there. Anyway, so I think that the takeaways here are that in the winter we need to wrap the hive to keep those drafts out, and also block off those vents on the top so that we're not getting excess cold air kind of falling down on top of the bees through there, blowing in and coming down through. So I think those are the two big takeaways. And if I think of anything else, I'll let you know. If you think of anything else, put it in the comments. And there's a lot to think about here. And one of the things that's been kind of sticking in the back of my mind is a Ware hive. If you've read about those, you have the frame. They don't use frames. They use top bars like that. So you have about 9 top bars like that. And so in the hive, what they talk about, I'll actually do this. So here's your frame sticking down. Your entrance comes in like this. What they do in the winter is they turn it like this. So this is called the warm way. And what happens is that air that comes in and goes up on these first couple of frames, and it's harder to get to the back because there's no direct movement. Then in the summer you turn it the cool way, and it allows the air to go up in between the frames. And so you wouldn't think that just changing the orientation of frames had that big of made that big of a difference, but it did for them. And so I think that we need to be very cautious about the airflow, because if there's a hole open at the bottom, which there is, and a bunch of holes open at the top, cold air, I didn't think about it, cold air drops, hot air rises, right? And so if the bees are having some amount of warm air going in, and there's cold air coming in those things in the top, it's going to create this cycle of increased movement in there that I don't think we want. So we want to have some movement, but we don't want to have a lot. So I think that blocking all but maybe one of those off, and maybe having it be on the end of where the frames are, would be the best thing. So the vent closest to the end would still be open, and that's probably enough. So I'll probably try that, and like I said, we're going to redesign the top anyway, so as I do that, we'll have some more discussions about that. If you have ideas, thoughts, whatever, put them in the comments. And I'm always looking for more ideas. So everybody, happy beekeeping, and we'll see you in the next video.